Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going, Joe?
Okay, Mark. How are you doing?
Doing okay. We got a light dusting of snow last night, and they're talking about several inches tonight, which if it happens will completely paralyze Seattle because Seattle cannot handle snow or ice. How are things over in New York?
We've got snow on the ground, and it's nice winter weather here. Happy Lincoln's birthday.
Happy Lincoln's birthday to you as well.
Did you know that Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, so he would have been 212 years old today if he had not been murdered by Hillary Clinton and George Soros.
And Hugo Chavez, right?
Yes. I heard that on the internet.
Yes.
It's amazing what you can learn on the internet.
Yeah, if he had escaped that assassination attempt, we would be buying him cards today that said he's 212 years young, not 212 years old. Okay, speaking of people who are 212 years old, should we get on to this week's topic?
Yes.
So my question came in two parts, and this is a very personal topic for me because it's something I'm dealing with in both my parents simultaneously. And the question is, what is dementia? I'm wondering whether it's just a new word for Alzheimer's and senility or if it's something new entirely. And then more broadly, I'm wondering, what's memory in the first place? When someone like my mother begins to lose her memories, what is it that she's losing? And then maybe on the flip side of that, is there any hope that she will ever get any of that back? So what did you discover?
Well, first, I just want to say I can't imagine what that's like to deal with two parents with dementia at the same time. But this subject is actually personal for me, too. My paternal grandmother died in 2004 after having suffered from dementia for at least a decade. Before she lost her memory, she was a fount of stories about her life and that of my grandfather, who emigrated to the U.S. through Ellis Island in 1921 from Sicily. My grandmother also loved to talk about the circumstances upon which their marriage was sorta arranged inside the tight-knit Sicilian community in Newark, New Jersey. This is years before Ancestry.com existed, and nobody in our family ever bothered to record her stories or write down the names of all the people whose lives she told us about. As my grandmother slowly faded away, all those stories about our family receded and ultimately died with her. And I deeply regret that today. So I'd like to dedicate this episode to her and to your parents.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Let's start by defining our terms, starting with dementia. How do you pronounce that word, Mark?
Dementia, so dementia.
Okay. I looked it up in the dictionary, and that's one of the two ways that it's pronounced. The other way is dementia, and I've pronounced it both ways over the years, but I think I like dementia better, like you. Dementia sounds like a girl's name, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is my eldest daughter, Dementia. She's named after her mother. Anyhow, dementia is technically a syndrome and not a disease. A syndrome is a group of symptoms without a definitive diagnosis. Dementia describes abnormal changes to the brain that trigger a decline in thinking skills serious enough to interfere with one's daily life. I'm talking about changes like the loss of memory, language, problem solving, and other cognitive abilities. It's an umbrella term covering over 100 specific medical conditions that impair thinking and memory. And just for the record, the medical establishment prefers to use the more precise term neurocognitive disorder, although dementia is still an accepted term.
It's a lot snappier than neurocognitive disorder.
Yes, indeed. Most cases of dementia are diagnosed in people 65 years and older. but it can happen to younger people as well. Because it's usually associated with older people, dementia is often referred to incorrectly as senility. Senility is an old-fashioned term that literally means of, relating to, or characteristic of old age. Its use as a synonym for dementia reflects what used to be a widespread belief that significant mental decline is a normal, regular part of aging. Here's the good news. It is not. For that reason, the word is no longer used by the medical community because of its negative connotations. You can still use a term like senile arthritis to convey that the arthritis emerged later in life, but it's no longer cool to describe a person suffering from a neurocognitive disorder as senile.
Okay.
As for whether dementia is a new term, my dictionary says that its earliest recorded use was in 1806, whereas senility is only slightly older, 1791. The term senile dementia came into vogue around 1851. Dementia is caused by damage to brain cells that interferes with their ability to communicate with each other. That communication controls everything we do. What type of dementia you have depends on what region of the brain is adversely affected. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia, accounting for anywhere from 50 to 80% of all cases, depending on who you ask. Alzheimer's disease was first named in 1910 for the pioneering work of the German psychiatrist Aloysius Alzheimer, who was one of several people working to identify cognitive disorders around the turn of the 20th century. Imagine having your name associated with something so awful.
Yeah, reminds me of the old joke that isn't it a strange coincidence that Lou Gehrig came down with Lou Gehrig's disease?
Yes, right. Yeah. But apparently naming rights mattered to these doctors even then. I can just picture Dr. Alzheimer and his colleagues divvying up the credit, right? Like, I get the brain disease, you get the anal leakage disorder.
Oh, I don't want the anal leakage disorder.
Right. One of the first regions of the brain impacted by Alzheimer's is the hippocampus, which controls learning and memory. That's why the first symptom of Alzheimer's is often memory loss. In Alzheimer's, abnormally high levels of certain proteins inside and outside of brain cells make it difficult for those cells to communicate with each other and stay healthy. Plaques develop between the dying cells in the brain, and tangles emerge inside the cells. As a result, the brain tissue in a person with Alzheimer's has gradually fewer nerve cells and connections, and as those cells die, the size of the subject's brain shrivels and shrinks.
Yeah.
Interestingly, it's still not known whether the disease causes the death of the brain cells or vice versa.
Could I ask a follow-up question there?
Yeah.
You use the term plaque, and most of us, of course, understand the term plaque primarily in terms of what you deal with when you go to the dentist. So is it the same scenario that plaque on your teeth and plaque in your brain is just a buildup of material that is basically undesirable material that sort of gloms onto something?
Yes, that's correct. I didn't do any further research into the chemistry of that plaque, but that is the concept.
Okay.
It's stuff that gums up the works inside your brain.
Right. And you can't floss your brain, so you can't really do
That's
anything
right.
to prevent it.
That's right. The second most common type of dementia is vascular dementia, caused by bleeding or a blockage that reduces or interrupts blood supply to the brain, often due to a stroke, but often exacerbated by high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or diabetes. Among the many other causes of dementia are Lewy body dementia, which describes abnormal brain cells that sometimes cause delusions or hallucinations, difficulty with balance, and sleep disturbances. Parkinson's disease, which is a degenerative disorder of the central nervous system associated with involuntary movement, but which can lead to dementia in its later stages. frontotemporal dementia, associated with tangled protein bundles in the brain's nerve cells, Huntington's disease, characterized by uncontrolled movements but also dementia, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, in which behavior changes, vision problems, and poor muscle coordination lead quickly to dementia, coma, and death. That last one sounds particularly grim.
Yeah. So I think the irony of some of these diseases is that for some of them, like for instance, Parkinson's patients, death might be the least frightening aspect of it because they get progressively trapped within their own bodies.
Some people have mixed dementia, which is a combination of two or more types. But like all dementia diagnoses, that can only be confirmed in an autopsy after death.
Yeah, as you're going through these things, it was interesting for me because I don't want to use the phrase ordering off of a menu, but I was noticing things that I had witnessed in my mother or my father, like here and there. Like my father did appear to have a stroke that accelerated his dementia, and he was experiencing hallucinations immediately after that. And so there were like these little things where it's like, oh yeah, I've seen that across the span of what you were talking about.
You know, dementia can also be caused by HIV, syphilis, traumatic brain injuries, brain tumors, even reversible conditions like vitamin deficiencies or thyroid problems. Let me give you some numbers about the prevalence of dementia. The WHO estimates that 47.5 million people worldwide suffer from it. The NIH estimates that about 5 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease. The Alzheimer's Association estimates that just over a tenth of citizens aged 65 have it, and that about a third of people aged 85 and older have it. About 200,000 Americans under the age of 65 also have what's called early onset Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is progressive and degenerative in that its symptoms usually start out modestly and gradually get worse. Doctors classify dementia's progress in 3 stages: early, middle, and late. Some common symptoms of early-stage dementia include memory loss, especially remembering new information, struggling to communicate thoughts, mood changes, apathy or listlessness, difficulty completing familiar tasks, confusion, a difficulty in following storylines, and repetition in speech or tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So I probably just scared the hell out of you and our listeners with that list.
Yeah, we're all thinking, oh my God, am I in early stage dementia because I do some of those things?
Yes. And indeed, many people do wonder whether their routine inability to keep track of their car keys or remember their doctor's appointments is a sign of Alzheimer's. The answer is possibly, but only if those symptoms get noticeably worse over time or are joined by other symptoms of more profound impairment, like getting lost in one's own neighborhood or forgetting the name of a family member or close friend.
Right.
Most people's issues around memory can be chalked up to normal age-related memory loss. And believe me, at age 57, I can testify to that.
Right. And what I have actually seen, like the manifestations of those symptoms that I've witnessed right in front of me, is the sort of scenario where the person will start off on a sentence and halfway through the sentence forget what he was saying. Like it's that level of confusion is probably the level at which you would need to be concerned.
Were your parents diagnosed with Alzheimer's specifically? Just curious.
I've not heard that word thrown about. It's just been the general purpose dementia,
right.
Which, because of your explanation at the top, I know to be a catch-all for pretty much anything and everything.
Yes.
But internally, we have our suspicions, and it certainly sounds like my father's may have been triggered by a stroke, and my mother's might be more just general variety Alzheimer's.
Right. So your father's technically would be vascular dementia.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no one test to determine whether somebody has dementia. Doctors diagnose Alzheimer's and other types of dementia based on a variety of factors, including the patient's medical history, a physical exam, lab tests like a CT scan of the brain, as well as the telltale changes in daily function, thinking, and behavior that often send a patient to the doctor in the first place. Some of the risk factors for dementia, like a person's age, are immutable. They can't be changed. But it's important to note that while we can't prevent ourselves from contracting inherited dementia, most cases of dementia are not hereditary. So I hope you breathe a sigh of relief with that information.
Yeah, that is a big, big concern for me. Yeah.
Yes,
so thank you for that.
Understandably. More than 99% of Alzheimer's cases are not inherited. It's only the tiny percentage of early onset cases, like pre-60 years old, that carry greater risk of being passed on to children and grandchildren. Of the other types of dementia, only rare types of frontotemporal dementia and Huntington's disease, both of which are caused by faulty genes, are inheritable. There are things we can do to help decrease our risk of dementia. For example, wearing a bike helmet or a seatbelt prevents head injuries. We've seen how repetitive head injuries in football players and other athletes in contact sports are linked to dementia later in life. Recent research reported at the 2019 Alzheimer's Association conference suggests that lifestyle choices like eating a balanced diet of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, omega-3 fatty acids, that's fish oil for those who don't know it, and vitamin D in particular, plus getting regular exercise, not smoking or drinking, maintaining an active social life, and regular cognitive stimulation all help prevent Alzheimer's. Since the pandemic hit, I've been doing the New York Times crossword puzzle almost every day, though I must confess it's to ward off boredom more than dementia. Mm-hmm. How about you?
Well, I like to think of this podcast as a good bulwark against dementia. This is my safe space.
I think it is.
Personally have been thinking that maybe a best case for me would be just to decide that for the rest of my life, I'm always going to try to learn a foreign language because A, it's really difficult to do, and B, that would force me into conversation with other people. And I've always heard that social engagement is also something that is helpful in preventing dementia.
Yeah. Well, foreign language was always the Achilles heel of my college career, but I would like to go to Sicily someday and see where my grandfather came from, so I might want to learn some conversational Italian for that visit. All right, all of that said, the sad truth is that most of the changes to brain chemistry that cause dementia are irreversible and ultimately terminal. In the case of most progressive dementias, including Alzheimer's, there is neither a cure nor a treatment to arrest the disease. The average person diagnosed with Alzheimer's has an estimated lifespan of 4 to 8 years from diagnosis, though some people can survive for up to 20 years. All we have are some drug treatments and non-drug therapies that either temporarily improve symptoms or slow the progression of the disease. As with cancer and so many other deadly diseases, the path to better treatments for dementia, or maybe a cure someday, lies in increasing funding for research and increased participation in clinical trials. For now, at least, many of us must live with the devastating impacts of dementia, and I'm not talking about just the patients. As you're experiencing firsthand, Mark, not only does the progression of dementia gradually rob the patient of her ability to function independently, but it also places a huge financial and emotional burden on the families and caregivers of those patients.
Yeah, it does. And it's given me definitely a different perspective on retirement savings. Because I think for most of my life, I thought that you save for retirement because you're going to travel and you're going to enjoy life. And I feel like now my understanding is that you save for retirement so that you can pay for your own care, essentially. Like once you become incapacitated, it is very, very expensive because you are living in this sort of place where you need 24/7 nursing care, and that simply does not come cheap. So all those travel plans that we have in the back of our head might just turn into a way to finance the assisted living that we require.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. My wife and I often talk about when we're making like retirement funding decisions, whether our 50-something-year selves need this money more than our 80-something-year-old selves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I can relate to that. I want to end this first section on a lighter note by bookending the talk about dementia with another personal story. This one is about my father, who was the eldest child of the grandmother with dementia that I described at the beginning. My father died in 2014. Thankfully, he never developed dementia in his 82 years on this planet. But he did have his share of age-related memory loss, including a peculiar mental block when it came to one of the terms we've been discussing. For as long as I can remember, my father referred to Alzheimer's disease as Alzheimer's with a K sound. He had many other strange words and expressions in his arsenal, so when he turned 70, my sisters and I presented him with a lovingly made dictionary of all the words we associated with him. I was the editor-in-chief of this tome, which we called the JLB Dictionary because those were his initials. Here's one of the definitions that I'm most proud of. Alzheimer's, noun. The name incorrectly used by JLB time after time when referring to Alzheimer's disease. Usage note. Habitually referring to a brain disorder by the wrong name, especially when that wrong name is constantly corrected by his children, may itself be an early warning sign of Alzheimer's.
Yes, it is the perfect self-fulfilling prophecy,
Right.
Isn't it?
All right, now I want to pivot to your other question about the nature of memory, which has engaged the human imagination since time immemorial. More than 2,500 years ago, Plato theorized that memories fade over time. His theory has since been supported by the research of cognitive psychologists and other neuroscientists. Wish me luck as I try to distill thousands of years of science and intellectual ferment into the 20 minutes left in today's episode.
Good luck. I'll try to stay out of your way.
All right, yeah. Physiologically, what we call memory is stored inside a latticework of nerve cells in our brains that communicate with each other. Nerve cells, or neurons, are elongated cells that look like trees with trunks, branches, and twig-like objects called spines at the ends of the branches. The spines of one nerve cell communicate with spines from other cells by releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters and neurohormones. The junction points are called synapses. Most sensory signals are physically experienced but then fade quickly and are lost, replaced by new signals. You may have felt a breeze on your left forearm at 8:13 a.m. today, but it's doubtful you remember it because it's part of the multitude of sensory background noise in your life. And I only knew about that breeze because of the secret camera I have trained on you 24/7.
I knew it.
Let me just tell our listeners, as your former roommate, the sensory background noise in Mark's life made such a racket it kept me up at night.
Yes. Yet later in life, I was able to blame some of that sensory background noise on the dog, but at the time in the dorm, that was not a credible defense.
It was all you, pal. But let's imagine, instead of that breeze on your arm, let's imagine you put your hand too close to the stove. Neurons begin to send chemical feedback into your bloodstream the moment heat is sensed, and different chemicals are released when physical damage begins to occur, which causes your body's motor cortex to react immediately by jerking your arm away from the burner. Hormones are released that alter your emotions as you scream, "God damn it!" and run some cold water over your fingers. The final take on the experience occurs in your cerebral cortex, your awareness center, where you convert the experience into a lesson learned. I won't do that again. All that chemical turmoil in the space of a few seconds is created at the cellular level via neural communication, a flood of neurotransmitters and neurohormones traveling between your brain and your fingers. A significant stimulus like a nasty burn is likely to form a more permanent impression than the breeze on your arm this morning. And that, in a nutshell, is the stuff of memory. Human memory consists of the ability to preserve the information we learn or experience, like your fingers run in with the stove, but also to recover that information. Memory involves three major processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is that chemical process I outlined in the finger burning example, in which sensory information is changed into usable form. It is then stored in memory for later use. Stored memories lie mostly outside our awareness until such time as we need them, which is where the retrieval process comes in. Retrieval means accessing stored memories and bringing them into conscious awareness.
Yeah, what I've heard is that the retrieval is kind of like taking the book off of the shelf, and that while the book is off the shelf, the memory can actually be affected itself, which apparently feeds into a treatment for PTSD, is that if you activate the traumatic memory while it's in active memory, you can then engage in therapy to reshape your memory of the event so that when it's then restored, it's restored as a different memory, which just blows my mind.
Yes, I don't touch on that specifically, but what I'm going to talk about absolutely supports what you just said. And I'm glad you focused on retrieval, because I really want to spend most of the rest of our time drilling down on retrieval, because the breakdown of that process leads to the memory loss that we associate with dementia. In people with healthy brain function, many factors influence the retrieval process, including the type of information being used and which retrieval cues are present. I'll jump into those weeds in a sec, but I want to start with this. Memory is not flawless. Sometimes we forget things. Other times we misremember. The process is far from perfect, as anyone who felt like they had a word on the tip of their tongue knows all too well. There's even a name for that tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon. It's called lethologica, which, according to surveys, affects 90% of speakers of all languages worldwide. It's the feeling that accompanies the temporary inability to retrieve information from your memory. Researchers say its frequency increases with age. It happens to young people about once a week, while older adults are afflicted as often as once per day. In many such cases, people can remember partial details, like the first letter of the word they're trying to retrieve, or how many syllables it has. Once you remember that word, you feel incredibly relieved and are quite sure you'll never forget it again until the next time it eludes you. And that in itself is a fascinating phenomenon. Researchers say that the longer you spend fruitlessly trying to recall that word that's on the tip of your tongue, the more likely you are to have the same experience again, since instead of learning the word, you're learning and imprinting the mistake of not remembering it. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, it totally lines up with my experience that there are certain words that I always struggle to remember. And like you say, it's a known error state in my mind where I know going in, I'm going to have trouble remembering what this word is. There's a specific word that I always have trouble remembering.
Yeah. So it's almost like that retraining you were describing earlier with the PTSD patients would perhaps come in handy here.
Yeah. Yeah, drain out the trauma of not remembering that word.
Right. Researchers have proposed various models to describe the organization of memory. One is the semantic network model, in which certain triggers, like the thought of a specific place, activate memories about things that occurred in that location. Looking at your childhood home, or even thinking about it while not physically being there, could trigger memories of how your bedroom furniture was arranged, or the color of your walls, how you played tag in the backyard, etc. The stage model of memory, proposed in the 1960s, describes 3 separate stages of memory: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory is the first stage, where sensory information from one's immediate environment, whether it be visual information, sounds, or touch, is stored very briefly, usually for less than 3 seconds. That's the breeze on your arm that I mentioned earlier. It's impossible to remember each and every detail of what we experience at any given moment, but sensory memories last long enough for us to retain a snapshot of the information after the original stimulus stops, so we can recognize what's going on around us. Now, if we pay attention to that sensory memory, it passes into the next stage, short-term memory, also known as active or working memory. Short-term memories usually last about 20 to 30 seconds and mostly consist of information we are currently thinking about or focused on. Freud called this the conscious mind. Many of our short-term memories are quickly forgotten once the task at hand is completed, but if you pay attention to something long enough, or you rehearse it or repeat it frequently, it can enter long-term memory. Long-term memory refers to the continuing storage of information lasting from days to decades. Freud called this the unconscious mind. These memories mostly lie outside our immediate awareness, but we're able to summon them into our active memory when needed.
Yeah, I'm flashing back to when I was in grad school and studying Greek on flashcards and just trying to force that, just physically force that information from sensory memory to short-term memory to long-term memory.
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk in a few minutes about ways you can commit things to long-term memory. But first, I just want to say, as an example of long-term memory, I can sing you the chorus to Love is Like Oxygen, the 1978 top 10 hit from the British band Sweet, even though I haven't listened to it in years. And I guess now that I said that, I have to prove it to you, don't I?
A 1 and a 2.
Love is like oxygen. You get too much, you get too high. Not enough and you're gonna die. Love gets you high.
Okay, well done.
Obviously, my days of fronting rock bands are over. But here's the important thing. Why do I remember that terrible lyric? Because it's in my long-term memory. Now, why it's in my long-term memory and what that says about me is a topic for another podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings me to forgetting. We forget things all the time. According to the memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus, there are a handful of reasons why. One is the failure to store information. This is essentially an encoding failure that prevents information from entering long-term memory. A classic example involves a penny. If you were to draw a penny from memory, you would probably remember certain details like its size and color, and maybe even Mr. Lincoln's profile. But you probably won't remember other details like the wording on the penny or the position of the year, let alone what's on the back of the penny. And that's because only the details distinguishing pennies from other coins are encoded into your long-term memory. Identifying a penny doesn't require any of those other minor details, so your brain fails to store that information.
Yeah. Quite importantly, because if you imagine the riot of sensory information that would be involved in, like, saying, taking a 4 or 5 block walk down a city street, if you remembered every one of those things, you would very quickly be overwhelmed. Like, it's an important part of your brain that it discards information all the time.
Absolutely true.
Well, like, for instance, my example from before, I would not be able to translate a Greek sentence now because my brain has judged that that knowledge of classical Greek is no longer important, and so that information is no longer accessible to me.
Yeah. And that's me with calculus as I try to help my kids do calculus 40 years after studying it. So here's a second way of forgetting. It's called retrieval failure. This is when you just can't seem to find that memory you wanted to retrieve. This is the tip of the tongue phenomenon I mentioned earlier. One possible explanation for this is that as more and more memories are built on top of one another, a certain amount of decay takes place, which leads to the failure to retrieve certain memories that are seldom remembered. Time is a critical factor that influences memory failure. If you don't actively review and rehearse some information, you can lose it within seconds as its neurochemical trace fades. Here's a third one. Interference of some kind, as when new memories compete with older ones, particularly when the old and new information is similar, making it hard to retain certain details.
Like if some cover band were to perform Love is Like Oxygen, then you would perhaps remember their version rather than the original from the 70s.
That's a good example. Yeah, I think that's true. Yes. But I want to give you an even more fundamental example. You probably remember what you ate for dinner last night, but do you remember what you ate for dinner a week ago Wednesday?
Nope.
Okay, I figured not. And that's because the memories of all the meals you've eaten since last Wednesday interfere with the memory of that meal. Unless, of course, Wednesday is Prince Spaghetti Day in your house. And yes, full disclosure, that's Joe showing off his long-term memory again by invoking a cheesy TV commercial that he saw 500 times in his childhood. And then there's motivated or intentional forgetting, which is where you try to forget things you don't want to remember. I'm thinking of that PTSD example you gave earlier, because these are often painful, traumatic memories that cause stress or anxiety. Such memories are often either consciously suppressed or unconsciously repressed. And I'll just add that repressed memory is a very controversial subject among psychologists.
Yes, because of the many examples of recovered memory that turned out to not been recovered, but were actually implanted by leading questions.
Which is itself a good podcast in the future.
Yes, our episode on satanic ritual abuse. That'll be a fun one.
And then the last example of forgetting I have is the cue-dependent theory of forgetting. This is what I meant when I mentioned retrieval cues a few minutes ago. Sometimes information is in our memory, but it can't be recalled without cues. Such cues are prompts that were present at the time the memory was encoded and that we use to trigger retrieval of that memory. For example, recalling details about your first date with your spouse might be easier if you smell the scent she wore on that first date. The perfume would be the retrieval cue.
Yeah.
It was present when the memory was created, so smelling it anew can trigger retrieval of that memory. Without the cue, we might have trouble remembering.
I found that scent is very frequently that sort of thing. I remember an afternoon from when I was in my early teens visiting my father. I remember that day every time I smell the flowers that I smelled that day. Like that specific scent takes me to that specific memory.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences with smells before I got COVID and largely lost my sense of smell, that is, but it's coming back slowly but surely. There are ways to hone and improve your memory. Cognitive psychologists recommend the following techniques. Writing things down helps to implant the memory in your brain. Attaching meaning to memories also helps. This would be like associating a person you just met with somebody you already know. That might help to remember the new person's name. Repetition, of course, helps memories become encoded beyond short term. Grouping information into categories makes it easier to remember and recall. And since many of our routine memory problems are associated with fatigue, going to sleep right after learning something new is one of the best ways to create a long-lasting memory of it. So everything I discussed in this memory section applies to memory in normal, healthy brains. As I said in the first section, the profound memory loss associated with dementia is due to the death of many of the brain cells involved in encoding, storing, and retrieving memories. Until recently, neuroscientists assumed that all dementia-related memory loss was permanent, and yet there was always reason to question that assumption because of things we notice in our daily interactions with people suffering from dementia. Many family members and caregivers talk about good days and bad days with these patients.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right, yeah. The bad days are when they forget your name or act like they don't know you. But then on a good day, your name is suddenly there again.
Right.
It makes you wonder whether memories in dementia patients are not permanently lost, but are instead stored in places that are harder to access.
Yeah, the image that's in my mind is a road that's taken out by a landslide, and it takes a while for you to find a new route to your destination, but you're still able to get there.
That's a nice image. And there are studies on mice that suggest that this could be the case, retrieving memories that were thought of as lost. The mice were suffering from a progressive dementia like Alzheimer's that caused them to forget that they would get an electric shock from being in a particular cage. But when scientists stimulated the region of the mice's brains where such memories were stored, the mice suddenly remembered what happened to them and froze up in fear as they were moved toward the cage. So the memory wasn't gone. It was just buried deep and needed to be coaxed out. Results like this from mice don't have any tangible relevance to people yet, but many scientists who study dementia are encouraged that we might someday find a way to unlock memories that we thought were lost forever. And to that final point, I have a practical suggestion, a modest proposal, if you will, in the interest of science. Now that a certain 70-something public figure with obvious cognitive decline is finally out of office and essentially unemployable, doing nothing while he waits to be indicted for his various crimes, I'd like to suggest that he be recruited to participate in a recreation of the mice study. We can put him in a cage, maybe one that's like the one he put immigrant children in, and then administer frightful electric shocks until he encodes a deep memory associating that cage with the shocks. Then we let the experiment play out as it did with the mice. Just think, Mark, he can finally do something useful for the people of the world. Nice image to end on, eh?
It's a bold idea. It does, though, undermine my project of escaping the trauma by forgetting all about his presidency. You've brought that back into active memory and made it harder for me to forget.
But you prefer to use motivated or intentional forgetting to eliminate the trauma, and that's understandable.
Yes.
So, have I answered your questions?
You have. For me, one of the things that's most interesting is one of the things you mentioned first, which is that dementia is not something specific, because there's been a bunch of movies about dementia this year. Like there's at least 3 that are coming up this spring. Anthony Hopkins is in one of them. It just seems to be really top of mind for the culture. And it's interesting that we would have this cultural moment for a term, which you said was coined in 1810?
Yeah, 1806.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so 200 years of history for the term. And just now are we starting to really think hard about it.
Yeah. I guess maybe the better question to ask you at the end of this episode would have been, how much of this talk I just gave will you retain?
Well, yeah, probably a little bit.
Let's just tell our listeners, if you already can't remember some of the details you heard Joe talk about in this podcast, don't forget that you can listen again and again until it's in your long-term memory.
Yes, that is the best way to consume the Mansplaining podcast, is just to listen to it over and over and over again until you remember everything that we say, because it would be a terrible shame if you were to forget.
Mm-hmm. Just doing my duty.
And thank you for making this quite interesting. It's a very depressing topic. I mean, it's just to share a little bit of the experience I, over the last year or two, have just seen my mother disappear into this. Her body's still alive, and like you say, she has good days where she's still there, but increasingly, she's just a pale shadow of the person that she used to be. And it's a very interesting, and interesting is the bad word for that, but it's an interesting way to mourn the passing of someone, because it's not like she dies in a car crash where you're dealing with a death suddenly. It's a death that is prolonged. It's a death that's largely painless except for psychological pain. And it's just sort of a slipping away, like she's, grains of sand in a hourglass, and you're seeing it all just sort of slip away.
Yes. Her essence, the thing that made her your mom, not just the vessel, the body, but the soul, or whatever you want to call it. It's just heartbreaking. I'm really sorry you're going through that.
And we really don't have a language to talk about that. And, maybe that's what Hollywood is taking on, is to start the conversation about how you mourn someone who's still alive. But it's been top of mind for me over the last few years. And it put the fear of God into me that, and thank you for reassuring me on that point, that because my parents are going through this, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm doomed to the same outcome, because it's definitely something I worry about.
I worry about it even with one of my 4 grandparents experiencing it, and I'm nervous about it.
And I think it's something which we all need to take account of in terms of just understanding what we need to prepare for in terms of our own aging and our retirement period. That diminished mental capacity is not anything that any of us want to consider, but it is definitely something that some of us are going to experience. And do we have the money to pay for that? Do we have the support network that will get us through that?
Yes.
Because I could not imagine anything more terrifying than to be confused and alone.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, listen, maybe I can distract you from what you just said by giving you the topic for next time, so you have something to think about other than dementia.
Something to distract me. Yes, so lay it on me.
Okay. So during this time of COVID, my wife and I suspect this is true of you and your wife as well, we've been really enjoying binge watching episodic TV. And one of the best things we watched together this past year was Mrs. America, the 9-part series about the women who were instrumental in the debate over the passage of the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Yes.
The ERA came very close to passage in the 1970s, but ultimately fell short of ratification due to the efforts of a revived conservative movement led by Phyllis Schlafly, who was brilliantly portrayed in the series by Cate Blanchett. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in the ERA as a few more states ratified it, and now with Mrs. America, it's on my radar screen again. As the son of an ardent second-wave feminist, my question to you is, what are the prospects for finally ratifying the ERA?
Okay, I will take that up because this was a very sacred cause for my mother, and I think a big disappointment to her that it didn't get ratified in the 70s. So in honor of my mother, I will answer a question that is very important for her.
And it's equally important to my mother, so I look forward to hearing your answer in a couple weeks.
Okay, so if you have any thoughts on this episode, or if you'd like to leave comments on previous episodes, we have a Facebook page, which you can find at Mansplaining Podcast. I hope you can come by, like our page, leave a few comments, or even pose a question, and we might answer it in a future episode. And if you'd like to help other people discover this podcast, and we would love it if you would help us, leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. So that's it for this week's episode. Thank you for coming by and sharing some time with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
We sure would.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.